Our first lesson today comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 7. It is part of the story of the great flood. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. May God add blessing to the hearing and the understanding of these words. If you would please stand if you are able for the reading of the gospel. Reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, another familiar story. One day, Jesus got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they put out, and while they were sailing, he fell asleep. A windstorm swept down on the lake, and the boat was filling with water, and they were in danger. They went to him and woke him up, shouting, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he woke up and rebuked the wind and the raging waves. They ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" They were afraid and amazed, and said to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" These are the words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
When was the last time you heard yourself say, "When it rains, it pours"? Sometimes we mean that quite literally. In the last couple of weeks, at least in the eastern side of Kansas, there have been some downpours that we've experienced where we may have wondered, is it once again the time of the flood that came from rain coming down like that for 40 days and 40 nights? It can also happen spiritually or emotionally. When it feels like we can't take one more thing, and then one more thing happens. When it rains, it pours. Why? We who are more mature and developed, we know that's not a question that is very often satisfying, but it comes to us from the very beginning, doesn't it? I'm going to guess that all of you at some point were toddlers. I'm going to guess that you weren't perfect toddlers. I'm going to guess there were periods of time that your parents were annoyed with you. And I would guess that one of those times was when you went through the phase of why. You know the phase. You say to your child, "It's time to go to bed." Why? So you can sleep. Why? So that you'll rest. Why? So you'll have energy in the morning. Why? So you can play tomorrow. Why? And on 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 and on, because they can outlast you. They're younger. As we grow and develop, we learn that there are some questions that can be answered when we ask, why are leaves green? There's that whole photosynthesis thing. I won't go into it because I can't explain it, but I know it has something to do with photosynthesis. But there are some questions that can't be answered. It's true of the faith as well. There are some questions that can be answered. Why do we celebrate Christmas? Well, it's the birth of Jesus, for us, the Messiah. Why do we celebrate Easter? Well, because it's the resurrection of Jesus, our Messiah. There are certain faith questions that can be answered, but there are others that can't. Why did my loved one hit that car head on? Why is it that that diagnosis came at this particular time in life? Why won't my son or daughter listen to me when I'm clearly smarter and wiser than they are? Some questions just can't be answered, but we can't quite keep ourselves from asking it. As I was praying over these scriptures this week, for the first time actually, I wondered to myself, is it okay to ask why? Why did God decide? Well, you remember, we looked at Genesis last week, and we looked at the beginning of the beginning, and we looked at that word that I still can't pronounce, but that I love, Merakaphet, the Hebrew word that means that the Spirit not only moved or swept across the face of the great deep, it also could have hovered or shimmered or danced. And that you can't really not be joyful when you dance. And so it was with great creative possibility that God danced across that formless void and saw the kind of good that could come out of that. In fact, God called it good as God began to bubble up with creativity in the midst of that and put form to that which was formless. And how wonderful it must have been, and God called it good. And now several generations have happened, and human brokenness has begun to be that which rules the day. So God comes to Noah and says, I want you to build an ark, and I want you to put 2 of every kind of animal on it. Why? Why? Why are the rains going to come on the earth? Well, rather than guess, let's answer that. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, God says this, or the scripture says this, in verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that the Lord had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved God to God's heart. Then in verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Wickedness, evil thoughts of their hearts continuously, and the word that is used twice in very short time, violence. Human beings are doing violence. Violence to the earth, violence to one another, violence to their spirit, and for God, being created in God's image as we are, for humankind to be violent, we were being violent against life itself. Violent with words, violent with thoughts, violent with actions. Do you ever get tired of it? Do you ever get just tired of the stories that come day after day about violence that seems to be spreading? It's called compassion fatigue. It has a name. When we no longer get our hearts broken at every school shooting, we no longer get our hearts broken at every church shooting or grocery store shooting, we no longer get our hearts broken for our brothers and sisters. There was a violent occurrence last night in South Africa, and 17 people lost their lives. Well, we can't care about that, can we? Afghanistan experienced a huge earthquake a week ago. We can't care about that, can we? They probably brought it on themselves. Compassion fatigue. When our hearts have just experienced so much, we're not sure that they can feel any more. Maybe it's not so surprising that God is grieved to God's heart, because human beings cannot find a way to live among and with one another on this earth without violence. And God's just done. We remember we looked at the role that Genesis plays. It's not the scientific explaining. It's the meaning making. And so when God gets done in this book of Genesis, God decides to wipe out, to destroy everything on the earth except God remembers Noah. Do you know what it takes to be remembered? You have to be known. You don't remember someone that you don't know. God remembers Noah. God knows Noah. In God's memory, by the way, friends, no one is forgotten. No one is lost. That's great good news. God remembers Noah. You know, when I get done with everything, I'm done with angry words. I'm done with pushing and shoving. I'm done with shouting. I'm done with the hatred that comes out of fear and insecurity. I just get done. And then there are people in my life who will say, oh, but Nanette, remember when you baptized Hudson and little Brooks? His brother was there and you said how much you loved them. And it's like, okay, I'm done with everybody except Hudson and Brooks. Well, I know, but don't you want their parents to hang around and take care of them? Okay, I'm done with Hudson and Brooks. I'm done with everybody except Hudson and Brooks and their parents. Well, you kind of like the grandmother, you've worked with her for. Okay, I'm done with, right? And then there's this person and this person and this person that we know. Do you know what stops hatred? Do you know what stops self-righteousness? Do you know what stops judgment and condemnation? Do you know what stops us from doing things to one another that human beings were never meant to do? What stops it is knowing each other. Stopping long enough to know our stories. We get passionate about issues like we're dealing with right now. And I would guarantee you that behind every single one of the most passionate adversaries, there is a story. It's an authentic story. It's a sincere story. And it's left the person who has that story on one side or the other. Neither one of them better or worse people, but we who stand outside and don't know the story, we're the ones who too often cast judgment. Do we fear not being right? Do we fear the wrong side winning? Do we fear everything that we cannot put a human face to? And if that's the case, then friends, we need to start putting human faces to one another. To valuing one another, to seeing one another. God remembered Noah. God knew Noah. God could see Noah. And then God realized Noah by himself is not going to be happy or filled with joy. Okay, I'm going to have Noah's family go with him. And I would like to tell you that God judged correctly with Noah because Noah was perfect, but let me just give you a little ahead of the time story. When they get off that boat, after how many weeks and days and being on there, when Earth finally appears, Noah gets stinking drunk. I'm not kidding you. You read the story. I'm not even kidding you. He gets drunk on wine. I get it. I'm surprised he waited that long. And then his sons commit a mortal sin. A child is never supposed to see their parent naked. Well, maybe the parent shouldn't undress him anyway. So the boys cover him up. Two of them carry him covered up backwards into his place so that they don't see him. One sees him and he dies. So Noah didn't save God because God was perfect. God didn't save Noah because Noah was perfect. God saved Noah because God remembered Noah, because God knew Noah, because God knew that Noah's worst moment was not Noah's only moment. Noah's worst actions were not Noah's only actions. Don't we pray that that's true for us as well? And could we not pray that that's true for our neighbor too? When we decide all those on that side are evil. All those on that side don't see the truth. All those on that side are just weak. All those on that side, and we don't know. And we don't want to take time to know one another and our stories. God was just done, except God remembered Noah. And God lifted Noah up. What lifts you up when you're hopeless? What lifts you up when you have compassion fatigue? I'm going to guess that you can say shopping on QVC, but I'm going to tell you that's not going to last. You might tell me that you can take a walk. That's marvelous. I'm going to tell you that finally your hope will be restored in relationship to someone else. I'm going to guess and I'm going to predict and I'm going to prescribe that when you are feeling hopeless, that you are with somebody who lifts you up, who knows your heart, who understands your spirit, whether they agree with your politics or not. Noah is lifted up, and thereby life is lifted up. And we understand from that story that God promises never to be done with humanity, not completely. And we're made in the image of God. Can we be in that same place? It took a risk, that Noah had to trust when God says, hey, Noah, go ahead and build an ark. And Noah doesn't live near water. Hey, Noah, go ahead and build an ark big enough. Okay, I'm being very literal here, friends. God says to Noah, build an ark big enough to take two of every kind of crawling creatures and birds and all of that. Two of every, the question really is, if the ark was made of wood, did they take termites? Two of every, I'm kidding. That's just, that's not important. Friends, that's why trying to take these stories literally is unreasonable. They're not meant to be taken literally. They're meant to help us understand the character of God, that God gets frustrated with humanity, probably then and now. That God gets ready to be done with humanity, probably then and now. And then God remembers God's beloved humanity and says, I can't do it. I love them. They're violent and they're wicked and the thoughts of their hearts are only evil all the time. And I can't finally give up on them. Friends, don't give up on each other. Don't stop loving. Jesus is in the boat, and he said to the disciples, we're going to the other side. And the disciples were like, well, normally it's not that great to go across this lake in the dark. That's okay. It'll be fine. I'm going to go with you. Oh, great. Okay. So they're in the boat. Yes, let's get in the boat. He said to go to the other side. We're going to get in the boat. And there's a funnel. I've not been there, but my understanding is there's sort of a geographical funnel at one end of that lake, and that winds can come down that funnel as suddenly as gravity will take a rock out of your hand and throw it on the ground, and a wind comes flying through that lake, and all of a sudden the waves are bigger than the boat, and they're being swamped, and Jesus is sleeping. Don't sometimes we think Jesus is asleep at the wheel? Are you leaving us to our own devices? Are you just going to let us destroy each other in the mess we've made of the world? And what do the disciples do? It's what we do. Don't you care? We're perishing. And it says Jesus wakes up and he rebukes the waves and he rebukes the raging wind, and there is peace and there is calm. And then Jesus says, where is your faith? That's the other thing I've heard this week in my spirit. Nanette, where's your faith? Because I'm going to tell you, I don't see very clearly a way through this hatred that we have of one another in this nation. Nanette, where is your faith? Because I don't see very clearly a way that there can be compromise. Nanette, where is your faith? Because I don't see very clearly how this beloved United Methodist Church of ours is going to find a way to treat each other with respect and grace, and the rest of the world is watching. Where is your faith, Nanette? Do I believe that in the midst of the struggle, God has not forgotten nor abandoned us? Matt Skinner calls the time from when the disciples left one shore before they get to the other shore, the time when Noah is lifted up on the ark, but the rains haven't stopped. He calls it liminal space. Liminal space. Space where you've left. It comes from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. It's when you've left one place and you've not yet arrived on the other. Can I tell you that ministry is done almost always in liminal space? Do you know that most of my ministry, what I have done with a majority of my calling, is to hold space for people when the storms come? We have a set of young adults whose mother died of COVID, and 9 months later, their dad died choking to death. They don't come to church anymore. I've talked to them several times. Nanette, I don't believe in your God. I know. I wouldn't if I were you either. I don't know that I'll ever come back to church. I'm not sure if I were you, I would either. Nanette, I don't think there's a God. I'm going to hold space for your faith in me until that comes back. Until healing begins to happen. You come to me and say, when it rains, it pours, and I'll say, sometimes it does. And I have said too many times in my ministry, if I had a magic wand, I would wave it and make this all go away. But I can't. I've said that so many times because I can't make unreasonable things be reasonable, nor will I try to explain them by saying that it was God's will. I don't want to believe in that God either. But I will say God has given me strength to hold space, to hold faith with and for you. You do it as well for your friends and your family. It's not an ordained thing. It's a thing that we do who are people of faith. When we know there is someone weak, we stand in strength with them. And when we're weak, they stand in strength with us. Well, friends, we need that in our world right now more than we have ever needed it before. And we're least likely to give it, because we've decided being right is more important than being in relationship. Well, I'm here to say I will protest that till my dying breath. And you know how much I like being right. I really do. But more than that, my faith tells me that I love being in relationship even more than being right. Friends, live in liminal space with one another, with people in this country. May this place of grace be a shining light to the world, that adversaries can come and sit in the same space and worship the same God and decide together that love wins. If you feel defeated and unseen today, as a woman, I stand with you. I hold space and faith for you. If you're a person who feels relieved today that this change has occurred that you've been waiting for 50 years, I will hold space for and with you. That rather than only seeing a victory, we will together commit to caring for 450,000 children who are in foster care. That we will proactively work for every woman in poverty to have options in the midst of emergency situations for what they need. You see, wherever we stand, there's work to be done. And the only way we can do it, friends, is in the same boat, in the midst of the storm, with Jesus. Jesus' presence, promising life. Amen.